I didn't expect the funeral to be quiet, but I hoped it would be simple. A gray morning pressed down on the church roof, the kind of low sky that makes every sound softer, as if the world itself is whispering. I stood near the front pew with a folded program damp from my hands, listening to the organ breathe out long, careful notes. The lilies by the casket smelled too sweet, like they were trying too hard to cover something sour beneath. I kept my eyes on the wood grain of the pew in front of me, tracing it with my thumb, counting breaths so I wouldn't fall apart in front of everyone. We had been married for 31 years. I knew how to be his wife. I knew how to be a widow, at least in theory. What I didn't know was how to be a stranger to my own life. People filed in with murmured condolences and tight hugs that ended too soon. I recognized most faces: neighbors, co-workers from the plant, my sister's church friends. There were the expected tears, the polite sniffles, the awkward smiles that tried to reassure me everything would be all right. I nodded and thanked them, my voice steady because it had to be. Then I noticed the others. They sat together, 3 rows back, on the left, not quite fitting in. A woman with careful posture and a dark coat that looked newer than everyone else's, and beside her, 2 young adults who shared something in their faces, eyes set wide, a familiar curve to their mouths. They watched the casket with a stillness that felt practiced, not grief exactly, something more complicated. I told myself they were distant relatives, maybe from his side, someone I'd never met. It happens, people say. Funerals bring out all kinds. The service moved on. The pastor spoke about faith and endurance, about the mystery of God's plans. I felt the words pass over me like rain I couldn't feel. When it was time for family to stand, I rose with my sister, my knees unsteady but obedient. The woman behind us did too. That was when I felt it. A prickle between my shoulder blades, a tug of attention that wouldn't let go. I turned just enough to see her lips move. She whispered something to the young man beside her. He nodded, jaw tight, eyes shining. After the final hymn, people formed lines. I braced myself for the long procession of condolences, the same sentences repeated with different faces. I kept my hands folded, my shoulders square. When the woman approached, she stopped a little too far away, as if respecting a boundary she hadn't earned. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, soft maybe, but edged with resolve. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said. Her voice was calm, controlled. "He was important to us." I thanked her. I would have moved on, but she didn't step aside. The young man and the young woman came forward, standing just behind her like witnesses. The young woman swallowed hard. "I'm Anna," the Anna said. "These are my children, Mark and Elise." Something in the way she said children made my chest tighten. "I'm his wife," I said, unnecessarily. My mouth felt dry. "Yes," Anna said. She nodded once. "We know." There it was, not a shout, not a scene, just a word that landed like a stone dropped into still water. I waited for someone to laugh, to explain, to correct the moment. Instead, Mark met my eyes. He had my husband's eyes, the same deep brown, the same crease at the corner when he frowned. "He was our father," Mark said quietly. I don't remember sitting down, but suddenly I was. The pew pressed into the backs of my legs. The church noises blurred, as if someone had turned the volume down. I could hear my own pulse, loud and insistent. Anna's hand hovered, then withdrew. "I know this is a lot," she said. "We didn't plan to tell you today, but it didn't feel right not to come." I nodded, because my body remembered how to be polite even when my mind had stopped. "Thank you," I said, the words automatic, "for coming." They left me there with my program and my breath and 1,000 questions that burned without sound. After the burial, after the last casserole dish was set on my kitchen counter, after my sister finally went home and the house settled into its evening quiet, I stood alone in the living room and stared at the framed photo of my husband on the mantel. He was smiling, the same smile I'd woken up to for decades. I touched the glass, half expecting it to be warm. I told myself there had to be an explanation that made sense. A long-lost adoption, a youthful mistake before we met, something contained, something that didn't reach into the middle of our marriage and rearrange it. I slept on the couch that night because the bed felt like a lie. The clock ticked, the refrigerator hummed, my phone stayed silent. In the morning, I made coffee and didn't drink it. I opened his desk drawer, the one he always kept locked, the one I'd never asked about because trust can become habit. The key was in his coat pocket, right where he always kept it. Inside were receipts folded small, a second phone wrapped in a handkerchief gone brittle with age. In the photos, he stood in places I didn't recognize, arms around children who grew older with each picture. Birthday cakes, school steps, a Christmas tree that wasn't ours. My hands didn't shake. That scared me more than if they had. I sat on the floor and let the evidence line itself up, neat as a confession. 31 years of marriage, at least 25 years of something else. I thought of the nights he worked late, the weekends he said he was visiting a friend out of town, the little gaps I had filled with faith because it was easier than doubt. I called Anna in the afternoon. Her number was written on the back of a program I hadn't realized she'd slipped in my hand. She answered on the second ring. We agreed to meet the next day at a quiet diner halfway between our towns. When I hung up, I looked around the house, our house, and realized how little of it felt solid anymore. The walls didn't move, but the memories did. They slid, rearranged themselves, asked to be reinterpreted. That night, I stood at the sink washing dishes that were already clean, listening to the water run. I practiced what I might say. I practiced saying nothing at all. I didn't know yet which would be braver. The diner smelled like burnt toast and old coffee, the kind of place that never quite shakes yesterday off its counters. I arrived early and chose a booth by the window so I could watch the parking lot, prepare myself for the moment their car doors opened. My hands were wrapped around a mug I didn't need, the heat pressing into my palms, grounding me. When Anna walked in with Mark and Elise, I recognized their steps before I saw their faces. They moved together, not touching, but close enough to share the same air. We ordered nothing but coffee. The waitress glanced between us, sensing something heavy, and didn't ask questions. For a moment, none of us spoke. The clink of dishes and the murmur of other conversations filled the space we couldn't yet cross. Finally, Anna folded her hands on the table. I met him 28 years ago, she said. I didn't know he was married, not at first. I listened. I focused on the way her fingers pressed together, the way Mark stared at the tabletop like it might give him answers. She told me how they met through work, how the relationship started ordinary and hopeful, how she found out about me 2 years in, already pregnant, already too entangled to walk away cleanly. He promised he would leave. He didn't. He promised many things, she said, and kept just enough of them to keep everyone tethered. We lived 2 lives, she said softly, separate towns, separate holidays. He came when he could. He loved the children. He loved you too, I think. I don't say that to hurt you. It did anyway. Love shouldn't require maps and calendars and lies. I asked questions I didn't know I had, about money, about time, about whether he ever spoke of me. Anna answered without defensiveness. Mark and Elise added details when she paused, their voices careful, respectful. They had grown up knowing they were a secret, knowing their father existed in pieces. They had resented me once, they admitted, imagined me as the villain who kept him away. Then they grew older and understood how complicated adults can make simple truths. "He didn't want us to come to the funeral," Elise said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but we felt like we had to say goodbye." I believed her. I could see it in her eyes. When we parted, there were no hugs, just a shared nod, a fragile truce forged in truth. I drove home with my radio off, the road unspooling under my tires. Every memory rose up to meet me, demanding reevaluation. The vacations that ended early, the anniversaries postponed, the way he guarded his phone like it was a second heart. In the weeks that followed, the truth spread in quiet ripples. My sister found out first, then my brother. Some friends pulled closer, others didn't know what to say and drifted away. I sorted through papers and accounts, discovering transfers I had never questioned, college funds that weren't for our nieces or nephews as I'd assumed. Anger came in waves, but so did grief, layered and complex. I mourned the man I thought I knew, and the one he had been to others, and the years I couldn't get back. Anna and I met again, this time alone. We sat on opposite ends of a park bench, watching children play. We talked about practical things, insurance, wills, the small legal knots left behind by big secrets. We talked about the children's futures. I surprised myself by wanting them to be okay. They were innocent in this, after all, just like I had been. There were moments when rage flared hot and sudden, when I imagined exposing every detail, naming every lie, burning his memory down to the studs. But there were other moments, too, quieter ones, when I felt a strange, reluctant compassion. Carrying two lives must have been exhausting. It didn't excuse anything, but it explained the tiredness I'd seen in his eyes some nights. One afternoon, I found a letter in the back of a drawer, addressed to me but never sent. He wrote about fear, about cowardice, about loving too many people badly instead of loving one person well. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He said he didn't deserve it. I folded the letter and placed it back where it had been, unsure what to do with words that arrived too late. As summer turned toward fall, I began making choices. I met with a lawyer, divided what needed dividing, ensured the children were provided for without erasing myself. I kept the house. I repainted the bedroom. I started walking in the evenings, letting the rhythm of my steps steady my thoughts. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, in mornings when the coffee tasted right again, in nights when sleep came without argument. I saw Mark and Elise once more, at a distance, at a school event I attended quietly. We exchanged small smiles. Nothing more was required. We were bound by truth now, not secrets. I learned that grace isn't forgetting. It's choosing not to let bitterness be the last word. Anger had its place, and I honored it, but I didn't let it decide my future. I carried the truth with me, heavy but honest, and built something new around it. Winter came early that year, or maybe I just noticed it more. The mornings were sharp and clean, the kind that make your lungs ache when you breathe too deep. I found myself waking before dawn, sitting at the kitchen table with a blanket around my shoulders, listening to the house settle. It no longer felt like a lie, just a place where things had happened. I started to understand that memory can change its shape without disappearing. I received a call from Anna in December. Her voice sounded tired, worn thin by the season. Mark had been accepted into a graduate program out of state. Elise was finishing her last year of college and struggling. They were trying to plan holidays without a father for the first time, and she didn't know how to navigate the absence. She asked if I would be willing to meet, just to talk. I said yes before I could overthink it. We met at my house. I cooked soup because it was what I knew how to do when words felt insufficient. Anna brought bread. The children, no, the young adults, stood awkwardly in my living room, hands in pockets, eyes tracing the family photos still on the walls. I hadn't taken them down. I wasn't ready to erase the years they represented, even if those years were complicated now. We sat around the table and ate. Steam rose from the bowls, fogging the air. Conversation started slow, then loosened. Mark talked about his studies, Elise about her classes and the pressure she felt to be strong for her mother. I listened. I asked questions. At one point, Anna excused herself to the bathroom, and I was alone with them. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt earned. "I'm sorry," Mark said finally, "for what this did to you." I nodded. "I'm sorry, too, for what it did to you." It wasn't an exchange of blame. It was an acknowledgement of shared damage. When they left, the house felt larger, but not emptier. Something had shifted. I realized that holding space for them didn't take anything away from me. It added a strange, unexpected layer of meaning. The legal matters resolved quietly. There was no public scandal, no dramatic showdown. Some people expected fireworks. I chose boundaries instead. I learned that dignity can be louder than accusation. I returned to work part-time, rediscovered small pleasures, fresh bread, a good book, the way sunlight falls across the porch in late afternoon. I stopped waiting for closure to arrive as a grand event. It came in increments. On the anniversary of his death, I visited the cemetery alone. I stood by the stone, the grass crisp under my shoes, and spoke aloud. I told him what I'd learned. I told him what he'd cost me. I told him I was going to be all right. The wind moved through the trees, indifferent and steady. Driving home, I thought about the woman I'd been before the funeral, the certainty she carried without knowing it was fragile. I wasn't that woman anymore. I was something sturdier, shaped by truth. The betrayal hadn't ended me. It had clarified what mattered. I understood now that love without honesty is just a story we tell ourselves to avoid loneliness. As spring hinted at returning, I planted new flowers in the yard. I didn't replace the lilies. I chose something hardier. Watching the first green shoots push through the soil, I felt a quiet confidence settle in my chest. I had survived the shock. I had faced the truth. I had chosen how to carry it. If you're listening to this and you've discovered a truth that rearranged your life, know this: you get to decide what comes next. Anger can teach you something, but it doesn't have to be your home. Healing is not betrayal of your pain. It's an act of respect for yourself. The anger didn't arrive all at once. That surprised me. I had expected fury to crash into my life like a storm, loud and impossible to ignore. Instead, it crept in quietly, slipping between ordinary moments, hiding in places I didn't think to look. It showed up when I folded his clothes for donation and paused over a sweater I'd bought him on a trip he claimed was for work. It showed up when I balanced the checkbook and noticed patterns that had once felt random, now arranging themselves into intention. It showed up late at night when the house was too still and my thoughts had nowhere else to go. People around me seemed relieved by how well I was handling things. They said it with smiles, with admiration, like resilience was something you could perform on command. I let them believe it. I went to work. I answered texts. I made polite conversation in grocery store aisles. But inside, something sharp was forming, something that demanded acknowledgement. One afternoon, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it. When I answered, a man introduced himself as a former colleague of my husband's. He spoke carefully, like someone walking across thin ice. "I heard what happened," he said, "about everything. I thought you should know he wasn't as careful as you think. There are people who knew." The words hit me harder than the funeral had. People who knew. Not just Anna, not just the children, others, co-workers, friends. Men who shook my hand at barbecues and asked after my garden while carrying the weight of his secret like it was none of my business. After the call ended, I sat in my car with the engine off, staring at the steering wheel until my vision blurred. That was when the anger finally stood up straight. I started asking questions, quiet ones. I didn't accuse. I listened. And slowly the truth expanded. There were trips that weren't necessary, meetings that could have been emails, a second apartment he'd shared expenses on with another man from work, a convenient excuse to explain time away. I learned how easily people excuse what doesn't inconvenience them. The betrayal widened. It wasn't just my husband anymore. It was the small community of silence that had protected him. I felt foolish, then furious at myself for feeling foolish. Trust, I realized, is not stupidity. It's a risk we take because love demands it. Anna called during that time, unaware of the storm brewing inside me. She asked how I was doing. I surprised us both by telling the truth. I told her I was angry. I told her I didn't know what to do with it. She listened without defending him, without minimizing. When I finished, she said, "You're allowed to feel that. I felt it for years." That sentence stayed with me. Allowed. No one had said that to me yet, not directly. The children reached out too. Not often. Small messages, updates about school, about moving, about life continuing despite everything. Each time my phone buzzed with their names, I felt the complicated pull of connection and resentment. They were living proof of a life I hadn't known, but they were also living, breathing people who hadn't asked to be born into secrecy. One evening, I took out the box of letters and photos again. I didn't sit on the floor this time. I sat at the table, upright, grounded. I went through them slowly, not as evidence, but as history. I let myself feel the anger fully, hot, then cooling. I didn't rush it. I didn't push it away. By the end, I realized something that startled me with its clarity. I didn't want revenge. I wanted truth to stop echoing in my body like a threat. I wanted to live without bracing myself. The next morning, I made an appointment with a therapist. It felt like an admission and a declaration all at once. Healing, I was learning, is not passive. It's work. And I was finally ready to do it. The therapist's office was smaller than I expected, tucked above a bookstore that smelled faintly of paper and dust. The waiting room had 2 chairs and a lamp that hummed softly, like it was trying to be comforting. I sat with my coat folded on my lap, staring at a framed photograph of a river cutting through a canyon. When she called my name, I stood too quickly and felt dizzy, like my body was still catching up to decisions my mind had already made. She didn't rush me. That mattered. She asked simple questions and let silence stretch when my answers ran out. I told her about the funeral first, about the moment Mark said the word father and how everything inside me went quiet. I talked about Anna, about the children, about the way the truth had widened instead of settled. When I finally stopped, my throat ached and my hands were clenched so tight my nails left marks. "What do you feel when you think about him now?" she asked. I waited for the right word and realized there wasn't one. "Crowded," I said, "like my chest is full of too many versions of the same man." She nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Over the next weeks, we unpacked those versions slowly. The husband who made pancakes on Sundays, the liar who scheduled his life in compartments, the father who showed up in pieces, the coward who wrote letters he never sent. Each version carried weight. None could be erased without damaging the others. Outside that office, life continued to test me. At work, a coworker asked gently if the rumors were true. I told her yes and watched her face rearrange itself around sympathy and discomfort. At church, I noticed people whispering less, then not at all, like the story had already lost its novelty. I learned how quickly scandal becomes background noise. One afternoon, I ran into a woman I hadn't seen in years, someone who had worked with my husband early in his career. She hugged me too tightly and said, "He loved you so much." I stepped back before I could stop myself. "Loving someone doesn't look like that," I said, my voice calm but firm. Her eyes widened and she apologized, flustered. I walked away shaking, proud and sad all at once. Anna invited me to Elise's graduation. I hesitated before answering. Part of me worried I would feel like an imposter in that room, applauding a milestone built partly on deception. Another part knew that refusing would be its own kind of wound. I went. I sat near the back. When Elise spotted me, her face lit up with surprise and something like relief. She waved. I waved back. The moment was small, but it anchored me. Afterward, we stood in a loose circle with other families. Someone took a photo that included all of us, an unplanned blending of histories. I didn't ask for a copy. I didn't need proof. I had been there. That was enough. The anger continued to shift. It softened at the edges, sharpened in the middle. Some days it returned without warning, sparked by a song on the radio or a man who walked past wearing my husband's cologne. Other days it stayed away, leaving room for grief to breathe differently. I stopped judging myself for the fluctuations. Healing, I was learning, does not move in straight lines. I made changes at home. I donated furniture that carried too much weight. I repainted the living room a lighter color. I moved the desk from the bedroom to the spare room and turned that space into something new. Each change felt like a small declaration of autonomy, a way of saying, "This life is mine now." One evening, Mark called. He said he was moving soon and wanted to stop by before he left town, just to say goodbye in person. I agreed, then spent the next 2 days rehearsing what I might say. When he arrived, he stood on the porch like he wasn't sure he was welcome. I invited him in. We sat at the kitchen table. He thanked me for coming to the graduation, for answering his messages, for not shutting the door completely. "He doesn't know what to call you," he said, "but I want you to know I respect you." I took a breath. "I don't have to call me anything," I said. "Just be honest in your own life. That's enough for me." When he left, I stood in the doorway long after his car disappeared. I felt tired, but it was a clean tiredness, like after a long walk. I realized I was no longer waiting for the pain to end. I was learning how to live with it without letting it decide who I was. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. The first real test of my steadiness came from an unexpected place. It was a Saturday afternoon, warm enough to keep the windows open, when I decided to go through the last remaining boxes in the garage. They had been stacked against the wall for months, labeled in his handwriting, a quiet boundary I hadn't crossed yet. I told myself I was ready. I wasn't sure that was true, but I went out there anyway. The garage smelt like dust and motor oil, the way it always had. Sunlight filtered in through the small window near the ceiling, catching on spider webs and old paint cans. I sat on an overturned bucket and opened the first box. It was filled with ordinary things: tools, manuals, spare cords. The second box held mementos, ticket stubs, a watch he'd stopped wearing years ago, a set of keys I didn't recognize. I held them in my palm, cold and unfamiliar, and felt the old anger stir. In the third box, I found a notebook. It wasn't a diary exactly, more like a log: dates, cities, short notes written in a careful hand. I recognized patterns immediately: visits, overlaps, evidence of planning that made my chest tighten. I closed the notebook and set it aside, breathing through the rush of heat that rose to my face. I had thought I was past this stage. I wasn't. Healing, it turned out, doesn't mean immunity. That night I dreamed of doors. Some were locked, some stood open to rooms I didn't recognize. I woke before dawn with my heart racing and the certainty that there were still things I hadn't faced. In therapy the next week, I talked about the notebook, about how it made the betrayal feel fresh again. She listened, then asked a question that stopped me. "What do you need from this information now?" I didn't know how to answer. The truth was, I didn't need more facts. I needed permission to stop digging, to accept that knowing everything wouldn't bring peace, only exhaustion. That realization felt like setting something heavy down. Around that time, a mutual friend invited me to a small gathering. I almost declined, but something in me wanted to test the world beyond my careful routines. The evening was pleasant enough: wine, laughter, conversations that skimmed the surface. Then someone mentioned my husband by name, casually, fondly. The room went quiet for a beat too long. I felt eyes on me, waiting. "He was complicated," I said simply, "like most people." The conversation moved on. I didn't feel victorious or defeated, just honest. Later, a woman I barely knew pulled me aside. She said she admired my strength. I thanked her, then corrected her gently. "It's not strength, it's survival. There's a difference." She nodded, thoughtful, and I wondered how many stories like mine lived quietly behind other people's smiles. Mark called again in late summer. He sounded unsettled. He'd discovered something about his father that troubled him, something unrelated to the family secret, but heavy in its own way. He asked if we could talk. We met at a cafe near the university. He spoke about disappointment layered on disappointment, about the slow realization that idolizing a parent can delay your own growth. He said, "I don't want to become him." I looked at him across the table and saw a man trying to choose differently. I said, "You won't. You're already asking the questions he avoided." When we parted, he hugged me, briefly, carefully. It felt appropriate. It felt earned. As fall approached again, I noticed how my reactions had changed. The sharp edges were duller. I could think of him without my stomach dropping. I could tell the story without my voice shaking. The truth had become integrated, not intrusive. I wasn't defined by it anymore. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the light fade, I realized something else. I no longer felt the need to explain myself to anyone. Not my choices, not my pace, not my forgiveness or lack thereof. The story was mine. I could share it or keep it as I saw fit. That sense of ownership was new. It felt like freedom. There was a moment, sometime in early October, when I realized I hadn't thought about him all day. The realization came softly, without celebration. I was standing in line at the pharmacy, listening to the shuffle of feet behind me, when it occurred to me that the space in my mind, once occupied by questions and revisions, had been filled with ordinary concerns again. Dinner plans, a book I wanted to finish, whether the weather would hold through the weekend. It felt like a quiet milestone, the kind no one marks on a calendar but changes you anyway. That weekend, I drove to a nearby town for a small art fair. I went alone. In the past, I would have framed it as something we were doing together, even if he couldn't come. I would have carried him with me in conversation, in explanation. This time, I just went. I walked slowly, stopping where I wanted, leaving when I was tired. I bought a ceramic bowl I didn't need simply because it felt good in my hands. Autonomy, I was learning, can be tender. Later that month, Anna called with news that unsettled me more than I expected. She was considering moving, not far, but enough to shift the fragile balance we'd found. Her voice carried guilt, as if she were abandoning something unresolved. "You don't owe me proximity," I told her. "We're allowed to keep living." After we hung up, I sat with the discomfort her news stirred. Part of me feared that distance would undo the fragile understanding we'd built, that without effort it would fade into something awkward or unfinished. Another part recognized that clinging to that connection out of obligation would be its own kind of dishonesty. I let both truths exist without forcing a conclusion. The holidays approached, bringing with them their usual demands, invitations, traditions, expectations. I declined some things without apology and accepted others with intention. On Thanksgiving, I cooked for myself and one friend who didn't ask questions. We ate slowly, talked about books and travel and nothing at all. It was enough. On Christmas morning, I opened the curtains and let the pale light in. There were no gifts waiting, no schedule to follow. I made coffee and sat quietly listening to the neighborhood wake up. I thought about the children, about how they might be marking the day. I sent a brief message wishing them well. Elise replied with a heart. Mark replied with thanks. The exchange was simple and complete. I returned to the notebook from the garage once more, not to read it, but to decide what to do with it. I held it in my hands, feeling its weight. Then I placed it in a box with other documents meant for the past, sealed it, and put it away. I didn't destroy it. I didn't study it. I chose containment. That felt right. As the year closed, I noticed how my inner voice had changed. It was less accusatory, more curious. Instead of asking why this happened, I asked what I wanted next. The answer wasn't dramatic. I wanted steadiness. I wanted honesty. I wanted a life that didn't require vigilance to maintain. One evening, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror and paused. I looked older. Not just in the way time inevitably marks us, but in the way knowledge does. There was something steadier in my gaze, something less willing to disappear for the sake of peace. I didn't feel hardened. I felt clarified. Before turning off the lamp, I thought about the version of myself who had stood in that church, holding a damp program, trying to understand why strangers were calling my husband Dad. I wished I could reach back and tell her that the ground would eventually stop shifting, that she would find her footing, that she would not be defined by someone else's unfinished honesty. I turned off the lamp and slept, not deeply, but without dread. The new year arrived without ceremony. No fireworks, no dramatic resolutions, just a morning that looked much like the one before it. Pale light and quiet streets. I took that as a gift. I had grown tired of grand gestures. What I wanted now was continuity, a sense that my life could move forward without constantly looking over its shoulder. I decided to take a class at the community center, something I'd always postponed because it didn't fit neatly into our shared schedule. It was a writing workshop, small and unassuming. On the first night, we sat in a circle with notebooks on our laps, strangers bound by curiosity rather than obligation. When it was my turn to read a short piece aloud, my voice didn't shake. I spoke about loss without naming it, about rebuilding without apology. The room stayed quiet when I finished. That felt like respect. A few weeks later, Mark emailed to say he'd settled into his new place. He sounded lighter, more confident. Elise followed with news of a job interview that excited her. Their lives were unfolding independently now, not orbiting the absence of their father. I felt relief at that. The connection we shared no longer felt like an open wound. It felt like a scar, visible, sometimes tender, but healed enough to bear weight. Anna moved in the spring. We met one last time before she left, at the same diner where everything had begun. The place hadn't changed. Burnt coffee, cracked vinyl seats, the same waitress who recognized us now. We talked about practicalities and memories, about regrets we'd made peace with, and those we were still learning to carry. When we stood to leave, she hugged me, careful and brief. "Thank you," she said, "for not turning away." I watched her car pull out of the lot and felt a closing settle inside me. Not an ending exactly, but a chapter completed. Some connections are meant to be temporary, their purpose fulfilled once the lesson is learned. Back home, I turned my attention to the future in small ways. I planted a vegetable garden and paid attention to what it needed: water, patience, sun. I cooked meals for myself that took time, not because I was feeding someone else, but because I wanted to. I stopped filling silence with noise. There were still moments of sadness, but they no longer frightened me. They passed through like weather. I didn't chase them away or invite them to stay. I let them be what they were. One afternoon, I found myself laughing, really laughing at something trivial. The sound surprised me. It felt like proof that joy hadn't been lost, just delayed. I held on to that feeling, not tightly, but with gratitude. I understood then that closure isn't a door that shuts, it's a widening of space. It's the ability to hold the full truth of what happened without letting it dictate every step. My husband's double life would always be part of my story, but it was no longer the center of it. As summer approached again, I felt ready to speak more openly, not out of obligation, but out of ownership. The story had settled into me. It belonged there, and I belonged to myself again. There was a day in late summer when I drove past the church without meaning to, a detour, a misturn, nothing intentional. I noticed it only when the steeple came into view, bright against the sky. My first instinct was to tense, to prepare for the familiar tightening in my chest. It didn't come. Instead, I felt something closer to neutrality. The building was just a building again. The place where everything cracked open had loosened its grip. I parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance, curious rather than compelled. The doors were open for a weekday service. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of polish and old wood. I sat near the back. No one recognized me, no one watched. I wasn't there to pray for answers or forgiveness. I was there to see if the memory still controlled me. It didn't. I sat for a while, listening to the quiet, and then I left. Outside, the sun was warm on my face. I realized that grief, when it's been tended to, eventually becomes background noise. It doesn't disappear, but it stops demanding constant attention. That evening, I hosted a small dinner, nothing elaborate, a few friends, simple food, candles on the table because I liked the way the light softened faces. At one point, someone asked how I was really doing. The question was sincere, not obligatory. I considered it carefully before answering. "I'm honest with myself now," I said. That's made all the difference. Later, after everyone left, I stood in the kitchen surrounded by quiet evidence of shared time: empty glasses, a folded napkin, a chair slightly out of place. It felt good. It felt earned. Mark called not long after that. He told me he was engaged. He hesitated before saying it, unsure how the news might land. I congratulated him without reservation. When I hung up, I sat for a moment, reflecting on how far we'd all come from that first awful introduction. The truth had not destroyed us. It had reshaped us. I began to think differently about legacy, not in terms of what is left behind materially, but in how we choose to live once we know better. I couldn't change the past, none of us could, but I could choose clarity over comfort, presence over pretense. I spent more time alone, but it wasn't loneliness, it was spaciousness. I filled it with reading, with long walks, with conversations that didn't skim the surface. I noticed how much lighter my body felt without the constant, unnamed effort of maintaining an illusion. One evening, I found the unsent letter again, tucked away where I'd left it. I read it once more slowly, then I placed it back and closed the drawer. I didn't need to answer it. The conversation was over. As the days shortened and the light shifted, I felt ready for whatever came next. Not eager, not afraid, just ready. The truth had cost me something, but it had given me myself in return. The final pieces of my old life didn't fall away all at once. They loosened gradually, like leaves letting go when they're ready. One by one, habits shifted. I stopped introducing myself in relation to someone else. I stopped bracing for explanations that were no longer required. I noticed how my shoulders sat lower, how my breath moved more freely through my chest. These were small changes, almost invisible, but they added up to something unmistakable. One afternoon, while sorting through a drawer, I came across my wedding ring. I had taken it off months earlier and tucked it away without ceremony. Holding it now, I turned it between my fingers, tracing the familiar groove worn smooth by years of wear. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel longing. I felt gratitude for the version of myself who had loved sincerely, without conditions, without backup plans. That woman deserved respect, not judgment. I placed the ring back in the drawer and closed it, not as an act of rejection, but of completion. Life continued, as it always does. There were new routines, new faces, new conversations that didn't require footnotes. There were evenings when I sat alone and felt content, and others when I felt the ache of what had been lost. Both were honest. Neither frightened me anymore. I had learned that emotions don't need to be resolved to be survivable. One morning, as I watered the garden, I noticed how strong the plants had grown. They leaned toward the light naturally, without effort. I smiled at the simplicity of it. Growth doesn't announce itself. It just happens, quietly, when conditions allow. I thought again of the moment at the funeral, of the shock that had split my life into before and after. If I could speak to that woman now, I wouldn't tell her it would all make sense someday. It still doesn't, not entirely. Instead, I would tell her this: you will learn to trust yourself more than explanations. You will discover that dignity is something you choose daily. You will survive the truth, and then you will live beyond it. I don't tell this story because it's extraordinary. I tell it because it's human. Secrets don't only belong to other families. Betrayal doesn't always announce itself with cruelty. Sometimes it arrives quietly, dressed as normalcy, and leaves you standing in a room you thought you knew. If you're listening to this and facing a truth you didn't ask for, I hope you remember this. You are allowed to feel everything without becoming any one feeling. You are allowed to walk away from what no longer honors you. And you are allowed to build a life that doesn't require silence to survive. Some endings don't come with apologies. Some answers never arrive. But peace can still be chosen. I am living proof of that.